The moment my husband's lawyer laughed and declared that prenups were not for broke girls, the whole room erupted in amusement. Everyone laughed except me. They had no idea that the paper they treated as a joke had quietly transformed me into a woman holding $12 million in separate assets and the power to decide their future. That night, I realized they had not signed a prenuptial agreement. They had signed their own destruction. My name is Rose Hart Cole. I am 36 years old, and tonight inside the private dining room of the Four Seasons in Chicago, I am invisible. The air conditioner hums a low, expensive note, chilling the sweat on the back of my neck. Despite the perfect temperature of the room, crystal wine glasses catch the light of the chandelier, refracting tiny rainbows onto the white tablecloth. It is a beautiful setting for an execution. Around the table sit the architects of my life, or at least the men who believe they are the architects. At the head of the table sits my father-in-law, Robert Cole. He is over 70 now, his skin papery and gray, but his eyes still hold the hard, predatory glint of the man who built the Cole Heritage Group from nothing into a real estate empire that dominates the Midwest. To his right is my husband, Ethan, at 40. Ethan still has the jawline of a college quarterback, but the skin around his eyes is beginning to sag. Betraying the stress, he tries to drown in scotch and false bravado. And across from me sits Patrick Gallagher, the family attorney. Patrick has silver hair that is perfectly coiffed and a suit that costs $5,000. He is the kind of man who smiles with his teeth but never his eyes. He is currently sliding a document across the mahogany table toward me. It is a modification to the shareholder agreement, a necessary step, they told me, for the restructuring of the family trust now that Robert's health is declining. I reach for the pen, my movements deliberate. I can feel their eyes on me. They are impatient to them. I am just a signature required by law, a formality to be cleared so the men can get back to the business of running the world. Patrick chuckles. It is a wet, condescending sound. He looks at Robert, then at Ethan before his gaze lands on me with a pitying sort of amusement. Prenups are for broke girls. Olivia, Patrick says, his voice smooth like oiled leather. It is just a formality to protect the family's wealth. You understand? The room goes silent for a heartbeat, and then it erupts. It starts with Robert, a dry rattling wee from his chest. Then Patrick joins in, pleased with his own wit. But the sound that cuts the deepest comes from my right. Ethan is laughing. My husband, the man who vowed to honor me, throws his head back and laughs along with his lawyer. I see the other wives at the far end of the table, the spouses of the junior partners. They offer tight, sympathetic smiles, but their eyes are cold. They are relieved it is not them being flayed open for sport. Ethan wipes a tear from his eye and claps Patrick on the shoulder. He leans in, his breath smelling of aged beef and expensive red wine. You have to forgive her, Patrick, Ethan says loud enough for the waiters to hear. I do not even know why we bother explaining the legal jargon. I mean, why would she understand she was just a junior analyst with a tiny salary who quit before she ever made it to the big leagues? The laughter swells again. I am the punchline. I am the girl who married up. I am the broke girl who got lucky to them. I am Olivia the housewife, Olivia the party planner, Olivia who spends her days selecting flower arrangements and worrying about the seating charts for the charity gala. I do not move. I do not blink under the table. My hand grips the stem of my wine glass. I squeeze it so hard I can feel the crystal groaning against my palm. My knuckles turn white, the blood draining away just like the color in my face. I stare at the condensation beating on the glass, watching a single drop roll down and vanish into the tablecloth. If I squeeze just a fraction harder, the glass will shatter. I imagine the shards slicing into my palm, the bright red blood mixing with the dark red wine, staining the pristine white linen. It would be a mess. It would ruin their dinner. It would be hysterical. But I do not break the glass. I slowly relax my grip. They do not know. They see a woman who stopped working 10 years ago. They see a resume that ended at 25. They see a dependent. What they do not see is the woman who spent the last decade reading every single financial report this family tried to hide. They do not see the woman who knows that the Cole Heritage Group is not the empire they pretend it is. I look at the papers scattered on the table, reading the text upside down. I see the debt, covenants. I see the leverage ratios. Ethan thinks he is the king of Chicago real estate. He thinks he is ascending to the throne tonight. He does not know that the throne is made of cardboard and the kingdom is underwater. The company is over-leveraged. The commercial properties in the loop are sitting empty, hemorrhaging cash. They are restructuring not because they want to, but because the banks are breathing down their necks, and me, the broke girl, I take a slow sip of wine. The liquid is cool and tart. They do not know that while they were busy buying yachts and leveraging assets to fund their egos, I was busy too. They do not know about the quiet compounding power of the trust fund Robert set up for me as a condescending wedding gift. They do not know that the broke girl is currently sitting on a net worth of $12 million in separate untouchable assets. I have more liquidity than this entire table combined. I could buy this hotel. I could buy Patrick's law firm. I could pay off the immediate interest payments that are about to strangle Ethan's company next month. I hold the power to save them or to let them drown tonight as I listen to their laughter. I realize I have made my choice. Robert stops laughing first. He is old, but he is not stupid. He senses a shift in the air. He clears his throat, a harsh guttural sound that commands silence. He looks at me. His eyes are watery and yellowed, but they drill into mine. He is looking for the fear he is used to seeing. He is looking for the submission. He smiles at me. A fin-tight expression. It is a reminder. He is remembering the day he handed me that trust fund. The day he thought he bought my obedience with a few shares of a worthless company. He thinks he owns me. I met his gaze. I do not look away. I do not smile back. I pick up the Mont Blanc pen lying on the document. The weight of it is substantial. I look at Patrick, who is wiping his mouth with a napkin, looking self-satisfied. I lean forward slightly. The diamonds on my finger catch the light. Ethan bought this ring with credit 5 years ago. He thinks I do not know that either. You are right, Patrick, I say. My voice is steady. It does not shake. It cuts through the lingering murmurs of the room like a scalpel. The table goes quiet. Ethan looks at me, confused. He expects me to be embarrassed. He expects me to blush and look down. I turn the pen in my fingers. Prenups are not for broke girls. I repeat softly. It is a very good thing I was never actually broke. The silence stretches. It is heavy and uncomfortable. Patrick blinks. His smile falters for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing as he tries to parse the meaning of my words. Ethan lets out a nervous huff of air. What are you talking about? Liv, Ethan asks, his voice dropping to a whisper. Just sign the papers. You are making things weird. I look at my husband. I look at the man who just humiliated me to make a room full of lawyers like him. I see the weakness in his chin. I see the fear behind his arrogance. I look back at the document. This modification they want me to sign would merge my voting rights with the family pool. It is a trap, a clumsy, desperate trap set by men who think they are hunting a rabbit, unaware they have cornered a wolf. I sign my name, Olivia Hartcole. The letters are sharp and angular. I hand the document back to Patrick. There I say, all done. Patrick takes the folder, his confidence returning as he sees the signature. He thinks he has won. He thinks my comment was just a bruised ego speaking, a nonsense retort from a woman trying to save face. He slides the papers into his briefcase, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Excellent, Patrick says, clapping his hands together. Now, shall we order dessert? I hear the Seul here is magnificent. The conversation resumes. The tension dissipates, smoothed over by the arrival of waiters bearing silver trays. Ethan puts his hand on my thigh under the table, a possessive apologetic squeeze. He thinks everything is back to normal. He thinks he can buy my forgiveness later with a pair of earrings or a weekend trip to the lake house. I stare at the white tablecloth. I am not thinking about the Seul. I am not thinking about Ethan's hand on my leg. I am thinking about a document that is not in this room. I am visualizing the original prenuptial agreement. I can see the font. I can smell the paper. I can see the specific clause on page 14, paragraph 3, the clause they all ignored, the clause that defined separate property. This is not the first time Patrick has laughed about my prenup. But the first time, 10 years ago, I did not understand what I had just been given. I was young, I was in love, and I was blind. I did not know that when they handed me a pen that day, they were not handing me a contract of surrender. They were handing me the weapon that would one day slit their throats. My mind drifts back away from the Four Seasons, away from the Chicago skyline, back to New York, back to the lights of Manhattan and the girl I used to be, back to the night I met the man who would become my husband, and the beginning of the long, slow con that led us here 10 years ago. I was 25 years old, living in a shoebox apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan that smelt perpetually of boiled cabbage and old cigarettes. I was a junior financial analyst at a boutique investment firm, which sounds impressive until you realize my job consisted mostly of correcting Excel macros for men who made 10 times my salary and stealing my ideas for their quarterly presentations. That very afternoon, my managing director had presented my risk analysis on a volatile tech merger to the partners. He did not mention my name once. He took the credit, the applause, and the bonus. When I tried to speak up, he told me to be a team player and fetch him sparkling water. I felt like I was drowning in testosterone and mediocrity. I was ready to go home, put on sweatpants, and rage eat leftover takeout. But my roommate, a chaotic fashion assistant named Sarah, dragged me out. We ended up at a rooftop bar in Midtown, the kind of place where a gin and tonic costs $1.20, and the view of the Empire State Building is supposed to make you forget you are broke. I was leaning against the railing, nursing my drink, and mentally calculating the overhead costs of the venue when a man appeared beside me. He was different from the sharp-elbowed, aggressive traitors I dealt with all day. He had sandy hair that fell slightly into his eyes and a suit that fit him with the casual ease of someone who had been wearing custom tailoring since prep school. He looked soft, but in a way that suggested he had never needed to be hard. He introduced himself as Ethan. He told me he was from Chicago. "I am just here learning the ropes," he said with a self-deprecating smile that made my chest tight. "Trying not to break my father's company before I eventually have to run it." I should have been wary. I should have heard the warning bells that ring when a man admits his career as a birthright rather than an achievement. But I was tired of fighting for every inch of ground. Ethan was easy. He was charming. We did not talk about the weather or pop culture. We talked about market caps and acquisition strategies. I tested him. I threw questions at him about leverage ratios and distressed assets, expecting him to falter. He did not. He answered them, but his answers were textbook. They were rehearsed. He knew the theory, but he lacked the hunger. "You analyze the market like a shark," he told me later that night, his eyes wide with genuine admiration. "I just read the reports. You actually see the story in the numbers." It was the first time a man had looked at my brain as an asset rather than a threat. I fell in love with him not for his money, but because he made me feel seen. Things moved at a velocity that defied logic. 3 months later, I was flying first class to Chicago to meet the family. If New York was a grind, Chicago was a coronation. Ethan drove me through the city in a vintage convertible, pointing at skyscrapers like he was pointing at family photos. "My grandfather built that one," he said, gesturing to a steel monolith reflecting the clouds. "And my dad acquired that block in the 80s. I was overwhelmed. I came from a family of public school teachers in Ohio. We had a mortgage and a savings account for a rainy day. Ethan came from a family that reshaped skylines. Then I met Robert Cole. The meeting took place in the library of their estate in Lake Forest. The room smelled of leather, cedar, and old money. Robert sat in a wingback chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching me walk in. He did not stand up. He was terrifying. He had the same eyes as Ethan, but where Ethan's were warm and welcoming, Robert's were cold calculators. He asked me about my background, my education, and my parents. He was not making conversation. He was conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition. "Ethan tells me you are sharp," Robert said, his voice raspy even then. "He tells me you understand the language of money." "I do, sir," I replied, heaping my chin up. "Good," he said. He took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving my face. My son needs a wife who understands him. He needs a partner who can handle the optics and the pressure. But you must understand something, Miss Hart. The assets of this family were codified long before you were born. The law is already written. I nodded, thinking he was speaking metaphorically about tradition and legacy. I did not realize he was speaking quite literally about legal contracts. 6 months after we met, Ethan proposed on that same rooftop in Manhattan. He got down on one knee, holding a ring that cost more than my parents' house, and promised me a partnership. We will be an unstoppable team. Olivier, he said, the wind whipping his hair. You are the brains and I am the face. We will build the next chapter together. I said yes. I said yes to the man, to the dream, and to the escape from the obscurity I had fought against my whole life. 2 weeks before the wedding, the invitation came. It was not a request for a cake tasting or a dress fitting. It was a summon to the law offices of Gallagher and Stern. We just need to handle some formalities, Ethan said, avoiding my eyes as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. Standard procedure, Dad insists. You know how he is about paperwork. The office was located on the 45th floor of a building Ethan's father owned. That was where I met Patrick Gallagher for the first time. He was younger then, his hair more pepper than salt, but his smile was just as patronizing. He sat at the head of a long conference table, sliding a thick binder toward me. It was titled Prenuptial Agreement. I felt a cold flush of humiliation. I knew what a prenup was. Of course, I worked in finance. But knowing the definition and seeing your fiancé sit silently while a lawyer explains that you are essentially a liability to be managed are two very different things. This protects the family legacy. Patrick explained, his tone breezy. It ensures that the Cole Heritage Group remains intact, regardless of marital outcomes. It defines separate property versus marital property. He opened the binder to a specific page. Essentially, Olivia, everything Ethan brings into the marriage remains his. Every trust, every stock, every future inheritance. It is separate property. And since you are the party with insignificant assets, he paused, letting the words hang in the air. Insignificant assets. I looked at Ethan. He was studying the grain of the wood table, refusing to look at me. I understand, I said, my voice tight. I am not marrying him for the money. Patrick smiled. Of course not. That is why this shouldn't be a problem. Then the door opened and Robert Cole walked in. The mood in the room shifted instantly. Patrick sat up straighter. Ethan looked like a child court expecting punishment. I thought we might sweeten the deal, Robert said, bypassing pleasantries. He walked over to the table and placed a single thin folder on top of the thick binder. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. We do not want you to feel like an outsider. Olivier, if you are going to be a Cole, you should have some skin in the game. He opened the folder. Inside was a stock transfer certificate. I am giving you a 5% stake in Cole Lakeside Holdings, Robert announced. I looked at the paper. I had done enough research on the family business to know what Lakeside was. It was a subsidiary that held a scattering of rundown cabins and undeveloped land around a lake in Wisconsin. It was the family's joke. It was the asset they ignored because it generated almost zero revenue and required too much maintenance. It is a small welcome gift, Robert continued. Put it in your name. Learn how we operate. Patrick cleared his throat. Technically, Robert, if you give this to her, we should structure it carefully. We will set up a revocable living trust in Olivia's name. The shares will go there. He turned to me, his smile widening. This creates a nice symmetry. Olivia, Ethan has his separate property trusts, and now you will have yours. It keeps everything clean. Anything generated by this trust or added to it from separate gifts remains yours. Forever. I looked at the document. 5% of a worthless company. It felt like a consolation prize. It felt like they were handing a toddler a plastic steering wheel so she could pretend to drive the car. But I looked at Ethan and he was smiling at me, looking relieved. He thought his father was being generous. He thought this solved the tension. Thank you, Robert, I said, swallowing my pride. I picked up the pen. I signed the prenuptial agreement that stripped me of any claim to the billion-dollar empire my husband would inherit. and then I signed the documents creating the Olivia Hart Trust, funded by a handful of shares in a company nobody wanted. I remember the sound of the pen scratching against the paper. It sounded like submission. I thought I was proving that I was not a gold digger. I thought I was proving that I loved Ethan enough to sign away my rights. I did not know that Robert Cole, in his arrogance, had just handed me the seed corn. He thought he was giving me a toy. He did not realize that to a gardener, a seed is not a toy. It is a forest waiting to happen. That night we celebrated with champagne. Ethan toasted to our future. Robert toasted to the family, and I drank, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut that I had just sold myself for a wedding ring and a pile of dirt in Wisconsin. I was wrong about the dirt. Patrick Gallagher turned the page of the document with a rhythmic, deliberate slowness, the sound of heavy, expensive paper sliding against heavy, expensive paper filling the silence of the conference room. It was a sound that I would come to associate with the dismantling of my life, a sound dry as dust and sharp as a paper cut. We were on page 30 of the agreement. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Article 4, Section 2, Patrick said, smoothing his hand over the text as if he were petting a purebred dog. This defines the excluded assets. Essentially, Olivia, everything Ethan holds right now is his. The trust distributions from the Cole family dynasty trust, the real estate holdings in his name, his current portfolio, and any future appreciation of those specific assets. It all remains separate property. He looked up at me over the rim of his reading glasses. In the event of a dissolution of the marriage, you have no claim to the corpus of these trusts or the income they generate. Is that clear? I nodded. I felt a strange mixture of boredom and defiance. I was 25 years old. I had a degree in finance. I was working on Wall Street, or at least adjacent to it. In my mind, I was not some helpless damsel who needed to be rescued by the Cole fortune. I was going to make my own money. I was going to be a partner. I was going to be half of a power couple, not a dependent. I understand, I said, keeping my voice level. I have no interest in Ethan's trust fund. I have my own career. Patrick offered me a tight, patronizing smile. Of course you do, and that is commendable. But we have to plan for all contingencies. He flipped another page. Now, regarding future earnings, the agreement stipulates that any equity Ethan acquires in Cole Heritage Group after the marriage will also be considered separate property as it differs from his premarital standing and family legacy. I hesitated then. That felt excessive. If we were building a life together, shouldn't the things we built during the marriage be shared? But I looked at Ethan. He was staring out the window at the Chicago skyline, tapping his fingers nervously on the mahogany table. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I told myself he was embarrassed by this. I told myself he hated this bureaucratic coldness as much as I did. I told myself that fighting over hypothetical future money would only prove Robert's suspicion that I was greedy. So I stayed silent. I let Patrick carve out pieces of our future and label them strictly for Ethan. Then came the interruption. Robert cleared his throat. It was a low, growly rumble that demanded immediate attention. We are not monsters. Olivia, Robert said. He gestured to the thin folder he had placed on the table earlier. We do not expect you to come into this family naked. He slid the folder toward me. Patrick took over the explanation, his voice shifting from defensive to falsely benevolent. Mr. Cole has generously decided to establish a revocable living trust in your name. Olivia, the Olivia Hart Trust. He is funding it today with an initial gift. I opened the folder. Inside was a stock certificate for a 5% stake in Cole Lakeside Holdings. I knew what Lakeside was in the hierarchy of the Cole empire. Cole Heritage Group was the crown jewel skyscrapers, commercial centers, prime urban land. Cole Lakeside Holdings was the jump draw. It was a collection of dated cabins, a few failing motels, and undeveloped scrubland in northern Wisconsin that Robert had acquired in a package deal 20 years ago and never bothered to sell. It was an asset that sat on the balance sheet gathering dust worth barely enough to justify the accounting fees. It is a gesture, Robert said, watching me closely. A welcome to the family. It was not a welcome. It was a test. He was handing me a scrap to see if I would act like a beggar and thank him for the feast. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "I truly appreciate it." Patrick leaned back in his leather chair, chuckling softly. "Seat simple. We just want everyone protected." Then he said it, the sentence that would ring in my ears for a decade. "Prenups aren't for broke girls, Olivia. It is just a formality to protect the family's wealth. We just need to be sure that when, excuse me, if anything happens, the family isn't being mined for gold." The room erupted in a small ripple of laughter. It was light, polite, and absolutely eviscerating. Patrick laughed. Robert smirked, and Ethan, my fiancé, my partner, let out a soft breath of amusement. I froze. The term broke girl hit me like a physical slap. I was not broke. I had savings. I had a 401k. I had ambition. But in this room, against the billions represented by the skyline outside, I was a rounding error. I was nothing. I forced my lips into a smile. It felt brittle, like it might crack the enamel of my teeth. "Of course," I said, "I understand." Patrick turned to the final pages of the agreement, very near the end. In a section filled with dense legalese about jurisdiction and severability was a small paragraph, clause 143. I read it automatically, my brain latching onto the familiar rhythm of contract language. Any assets gifted to either party during the course of the marriage, if deposited directly into their respected separate revocable trusts, shall remain the sole and separate property of that beneficiary, regardless of commingling of other marital funds, and shall not be subject to equitable distribution. I paused on the words. It was standard asset protection language. It was designed, I assume, to ensure that if Robert gave Ethan $100 million next year, I couldn't touch it. It was another wall being built to keep me out. I looked at Patrick. "Does this apply to my trust as well?" I asked, pointing to the clause. Patrick waved a hand dismissively. "Legally, yes. The language is reciprocal. If someone gives you $1 million and you put it in the Olivia Hart Trust, it stays yours." But he trailed off, his eyes twinkling with that same insulting humor. The implication was clear. Who is going to give you $1 million? I looked at the document. I looked at the structure, a separate trust, a clause that explicitly protected gifts and the growth of those gifts from becoming marital property. I thought, this is how rich people stay rich. They built silos. I did not understand then that they had just built a silo for me. I thought I was looking at a cage, that I was looking at a fortress. Robert reached for the pen first. He signed the stock transfer certificate with a flourish, his signature large and aggressive. He pushed the paper toward me. "To ensure you do not feel completely empty-handed," he said. His eyes were cold. He looked at me not with affection, but with the calculated indifference of a man feeding a stray cat, so it stops meowing at the door. He was planting a pawn on his chessboard, a piece he considered so insignificant he didn't bother to guard it. I picked up the pen. It was a Mont-Blanc, heavy and black, the resin warm from Robert's grip. The smell of the room, the old paper, the lemon polish on the table, the faint scent of Ethan's cologne suddenly made me feel nauseous. I looked at Ethan one last time. He reached out and covered my left hand with his. His palm was warm. His thumb rubbed against my engagement ring. "You do not have to worry about any of this legal stuff." "Live," he whispered, leaning in close so his father wouldn't hear. "This is just to let my dad sleep at night. I promise you, I will never use this piece of paper against you. We are a team. What is mine is yours." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man I loved was different from the cold machinery of his family. I wanted to believe that love was stronger than contract law. So I signed. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and wrote, "Olivia Hart." The ink flowed black and permanent. I signed the prenup that declared me a financial zero. I signed the trust document that accepted 5%. Scratch. The sound of a track snapping shut. "Excellent," Patrick said, snapping the binder closed as soon as I lifted the pen. "That wasn't so painful, was it?" Robert stood up, checking his watch. "Now that is done. We have a dinner reservation at Gibson's. Do not be late, Ethan." He walked out without looking at me again. Patrick followed, tucking the signed documents into his briefcase as if he were bagging a trophy. Ethan stood up and pulled me into a hug. He kissed the top of my head. "I am proud of you," he said. "I know that was hard, but now we can just focus on the wedding. Now we can focus on ourselves." He smiled, a boyish, relieved smile that made my heart ache. "I am going to run to the restroom," he said. "Meet you at the elevator." He walked out, leaving me alone in the massive conference room. I stood there looking at the empty table. The binders were gone. The lawyers were gone. The only thing left was the faint indentation on the notepad where I had pressed down too hard while signing. I touched the spot on the paper. Ethan had promised he would never use that document against me. He had called it a formality. I walked to the window and looked down at the city below, at the tiny cars moving like blood cells through the arteries of Chicago. I did not know it then, standing 45 floors above the ground, but I had just signed 2 death warrants. One was for my naive belief in romantic partnership. The other, the one buried in Clause 183 and hidden inside the worthless shares of full Lakeside Holdings, was a death warrant for the Cole family empire. They thought they had stripped me of my armor. In reality, they had just handed me a knife, patted me on the head, and told me to go play in the corner while they turned their backs. And one day I would use it. The transition from the adrenaline-soaked trading floors of Lower Manhattan to the manicured silence of Lake Forest, Illinois, was not a crash. It was a slow leap. It was the sound of air hissing out of a tire so quietly you do not realize you are flat until you try to drive away and the rim grinds against the pavement. After the wedding, I packed my sharp blazers and my ergonomic calculator into boxes. We moved into a colonial mansion that was too big for 2 people. A house that echoed with the ghost of expectations. I told myself, and Ethan told me, that this was temporary. Chicago has plenty of firms. "Live," he said, carrying me over the threshold. "But let us just enjoy the first year. You have worked so hard. Take a breath. Decorate the house. Be a wife." I took a breath. I inhaled the scent of expensive potpourri and floor wax, and I exhaled my ambition. The first year passed in a blur of color, swatches, and caterers. I learned that there are 14 shades of white, and that choosing the wrong one for the guest bedroom is a moral failing. I joined a yoga studio where the women wore leggings that cost more than my first car. I learned to bake galettes for charity bake sales, kneading the dough with a ferocity that should have worried me. Ethan, meanwhile, was ascending. He went to the headquarters of Cole Heritage Group every morning at 7. He came home at 8:00 in the evening, smelling of scotch and self-importance. Over dinner, he would recount his day, treating me like an audience of one. He told me about the deals, the leverage, the zoning battles. I would listen, nodding, occasionally interjecting with a question about interest rate exposure or cap rates. At first, he smiled when I asked. Then he started looking annoyed. "You do not have to worry about the math, Bade," he would say, cutting into his steak. "That is why I hire quants. Just tell me if you like the tie I chose for the meeting." The suffocation began in earnest when I started printing resumes. It had been 14 months. I was bored. My brain felt like a muscle that was atrophying from lack of use. I found a position at a mid-sized equity firm in the Loop. That was perfect. I brought it up at Sunday dinner with Robert. "I am thinking of getting back into the game," I said, passing the roasted potatoes. "There is a senior analyst role opening up downtown." Robert stopped chewing. He looked at Ethan, then at me. "Is there a financial need I am unaware of?" Robert asked. "Is my son not providing adequately?" "No, of course not," I stammered. "It is just, I want to work. I miss the challenge." Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand. It was a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a restraint. "Babe, we talked about this. You do not need to grind yourself down for a paycheck anymore. Besides, your value here is so much higher." My value here meant the house. Here meant the country club. Here meant ensuring that the Cole family social calendar ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. Robert nodded in agreement. "Ethan is right. A wife who understands how to manage the social network is worth 10 analysts. You help him more by hosting the mayor for dinner than you would by staring at spreadsheets for strangers." I withdrew the application. I told myself they were right. I told myself I was being a partner. I became the best damn hostess in Lake Forest. I memorized the names of every banker's wife, every lawyer's mistress, and every politician's children. I curated wine lists that impressed sleazes. I organized galas that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was efficient. I was charming. I was the perfect accessory. But on paper, I was a zero. I remember a lunch at the country club 3 years into the marriage. I was sitting with 4 other wives, women who had been in this ecosystem for decades. They were discussing a trip to the Maldives and comparing the waiting lists for Hermes bags. One of them, a woman named Carolyn, whose husband owned a chain of dealerships, turned to me. "So, Olivia, what do you do with your day? I mean, besides the charity stuff, what do you do for fun?" I took a sip of my iced tea. "I manage some family investments," I said. "I like to keep an eye on the markets." Caroline laughed. It was a tinkling, dismissive sound. "Oh, that is cute," she said. "My husband set up a little trading account for me, too. It is fun to play around, isn't it? Like fantasy football, but with stocks." I smiled. My jaw itched. "Yes," I said, "just like fantasy football." I went home that afternoon and walked straight into the library. I pulled out the file for the Olivia Hart Trust. It had been sitting in the safe for 3 years. I had never touched it. Every quarter, a statement arrived, and I filed it away without looking. I opened the latest statement. The trust held exactly what it had held on the day I signed the prenup: 5% of the outstanding shares of Coal Lakeside Holdings. The value listed was nominal. There was no cash in the account, just these stagnant shares. I felt a spark of old curiosity. I went to my laptop and logged into the Secretary of State's database. I pulled the public filings for Lakeside. It was a mess. The company owned 12 properties. 3 were shuttered. The others were operating at break-even. It was a portfolio of neglect. But as I looked at the addresses, something clicked in my brain. 2 of the properties were on lakes that had recently been rezoned for luxury development. Another was sitting on a parcel of land near a proposed highway expansion. This wasn't just junk. It was undervalued junk. That night, I asked Ethan if I could see the detailed financials for Lakeside. He laughed. "Lakeside? Why on earth do you care about that old dog? It is just a tax write-off live." "I am curious." I said. "It is the only thing in my name. I want to understand it." He shrugged. "Ask Patrick if he has time to dig them out of the archive." When I emailed Patrick, the response took 3 days. When the files finally arrived, they came with a note from Robert: "Olivia, do not waste your pretty head on this. Lakeside is a training wheel company. If you are bored, redecorate the sunroom." I read the note. Then I read the financials. I saw the mismanagement. I saw the bloat. I saw the potential. I started waking up at 5:30 in the morning, while Ethan snored, oblivious in the master suite. I was downstairs in the kitchen drinking black coffee and building valuation models on my laptop. I treated Lakeside like a hostile takeover target. I analyzed every acre, every liability. I realized that if the company sold the 2 shuttered motel and reinvested the capital into renovating the flagship lodge, the cash flow would triple in 18 months. But I could not do anything. I was a minority shareholder. I had no voting power. I was just a passenger in a car driven by men who were asleep at the wheel. The resentment began to calcify. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a hardening of the arteries. Every time I picked up Ethan's dry cleaning, I felt it. Every time I smiled at a rude partner during a dinner party, I felt it. Every time Ethan introduced me as my better half and then proceeded to talk over me for 2 hours, I felt it. He started calling me his little house manager. "Hey, my little house manager. Did you remember to call the landscaper?" It was meant to be affectionate. It felt like a leash. The breaking point came in the 5th year. We had hosted a dinner for the board of directors. It was a triumph. The food was perfect. The conversation flowed. And I had single-handedly smoothed over a conflict between the CFO and the VP of operations regarding a golf handicap. After everyone left, Ethan and I were in the bedroom. He was drunk, loosening his tie, his face flushed with the success of the evening. You were great tonight. Live, he slurred, falling onto the bed. Thank you, I said, taking off my earrings in front of the vanity. Seriously, he said, you are so good at this. He rolled over and looked at the ceiling. I am so glad I got you out of that rat race in New York. I froze, my hand hovered over the jewelry box. What do you mean? I asked quietly. You know, he mumbled, his eyes closing. You were struggling. That analyst job, it was killing you. You were never going to make a partner. It is a Shark Tank. I saved you from that. I saved you from becoming one of those hard, lonely career women. Now look at you. You have a great life. He let out a long sigh. I saved you, he whispered. A minute later, he was snoring. I sat in the vanity for a long time. I looked at my reflection. I saw the lines around my eyes. I saw the diamond necklace he had given me for our anniversary. It looked like a collar. He did not see me as a partner. He saw me as a rescued dog. He thought he had done me a favor by clipping my wings and putting me in a gilded cage. He thought my ambition was a flaw he had corrected. I stood up. I walked out of the bedroom and down the hall to the library. I opened the safe. I took out the prenup. I sat on the floor, the heavy document in my lap. I turned to the back. Clause 15(3). Any assets gifted to either party, if deposited directly into their respective separate revocable trusts, shall remain the sole and separate property, regardless of commingling, and shall not be subject to equitable distribution. I read it again. Then I pulled out the trust deed for the Olivia Hart Trust. I looked at the language. It was a revocable trust. I was the trustee. I had the power to manage the assets within it. Robert had given me the shares to make me feel included. He had given me the trust to keep the assets separate from Ethan to protect the family. But in doing so, he had created a sealed vessel. If I could generate value inside this vessel, if I could turn that 5% into something real, it would never be theirs. It would be mine. Totally, completely mine. They thought Lakeside was a joke. They thought I was a joke. I looked at the numbers in my head. I looked at the valuation models I had built at 5:30 in the morning. I was not a house manager. I was a portfolio manager who had been forced to manage a household. But I still had one client, me, and it was time to get to work. I knew I could not go to Patrick Gallagher. Asking the family lawyer to explain the loopholes in the family trust would be like asking a fox to inspect the structural integrity of the hen house. I needed someone hungry. I needed someone who did not spend their weekends playing golf with my father-in-law at the country club. I found Marissa Hale. She ran a boutique wealth management firm in the West Loop, far away from the mahogany-paneled offices of the coal empire. She was sharp, efficient, and wore blazers that looked like armor. I sat in her office with a stack of documents 3 in thick. I told her I just wanted a second opinion on my estate planning. Marissa spent 20 minutes reading in silence. The only sound was the hum of the traffic outside and the turning of pages. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. Mrs. Cold, she said, tapping a manicured nail on the document. Do you understand the vehicle you are driving here? I told her I knew it was a revocable trust funded by a gift. No, she said, leaning forward, it is not just a trust. It is a bunker, a nuclear-proof bunker. She pulled out a highlighter and drew a thick yellow line through clause 143. Your father-in-law set this up to keep his son's money out of your hands. But in doing so, he created a closed loop. Listen to me carefully. The principal is the stock in Coal Lakeside Holdings. That is separate property because it was a gift. But this clause states that any income derived from that separate property, provided it is reinvested directly into the trust and never commingled with a joint account, retains its status as separate property. She looked at me, waiting for it to sink in. If that stock pays a dividend and you keep it in the trust, it is yours. If you use that dividend to buy Google stock, and the Google stock goes up 10,000%, it is yours. If you buy a building with the proceeds, the building is yours. It does not matter if you are married for 50 years. It does not matter if your husband makes $1 billion. This silo is completely impermeable to marital distribution laws. I sat back. I felt a strange buzzing in my fingertips. So I asked, keeping my voice steady. "If I make this money grow, Ethan cannot touch it. He cannot touch a dime." Barrister confirmed, "Unless you write him a check." We looked at each other. A silent understanding passed between us. Marissa was not just looking at a client anymore. She was looking at a co-conspirator. "Let us look at the asset," she said, opening the file on Cole Lakeside Holdings to the Cole family. Lakeside was the ugly duckling. It was a collection of mid-range cabins and outdated lodges in Wisconsin that Robert had bought in the 90s and forgotten about. But I had been analyzing the trends. The recession had changed how people vacationed. Families were not flying to Paris. They were driving 2 hours to a lake house. Domestic tourism was exploding. The remote work trend was just starting to flicker to life, meaning people wanted escapes within driving distance of Chicago. Lakeside was sitting on prime waterfront real estate that was currently being valued as swamp land. I looked at Marissa. "We are not going to sell the shares," I said. "We are going to ride the wave, and we are going to use the cash flow to build a war chest." That meeting marked the beginning of my double life. By day, I was Olivia Cole, the perfect suburban wife. I wore pastels. I attended committee meetings for the Botanical Garden. I discussed the merits of private schools versus boarding schools over salads that consisted mostly of kale and air. I picked up Ethan's dry cleaning and smiled when he patted me on the head. But by night, after Ethan had passed out from his third scotch, I became a portfolio manager. I sat in the guest bedroom with the door locked, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. I watched the dividends from Lakeside hit the trust account. At first, it was small, a few thousand here and there, but then the market turned just as I predicted. The desire for local travel surged. The revenue from Lakeside doubled, then tripled. The board of directors at Lakeside, a group of sleepy old men who barely paid attention, started issuing larger dividends to keep the shareholders happy. Robert and Ethan did not notice to them. The checks depositing into my trust were allowance money. They saw a few $100,000 a year and thought, "How cute. She has pinned money." They did not see what I was doing with it. I did not spend it on shoes. I did not spend it on handbags. I reinvested every single cent. With Marissa's help, I leveraged the portfolio. We did not take crazy risks. We bought boring, unsexy assets that generated cash. We bought real estate investment trusts. We bought utility stocks with high yields. We bought municipal bonds. I treated the Olivia Hart Trust like a hedge fund. I used margin loans against the portfolio to buy into a logistics company that Marissa found, a company that exploded in value when online shopping took over the world. The compounding effect is a beautiful, terrifying thing. Einstein called it the eighth wonder of the world. I watched it work in real time. Money begat money. The snowball rolled down the hill, gathering mass faster and faster. 3 years in, the trust was worth $2 million. 5 years in, it was worth $5 million. I remember the fear. I was terrified that Ethan would ask to see a statement. I was terrified that Robert would remember the little gift he had given me and demand an audit. I tested the waters once during our 6th anniversary dinner. We were at a steakhouse in the city. Ethan was in a good mood because he had just closed a deal on a commercial tower in the Loop. A deal I knew was over-leveraged, but I said nothing. "I have been reading up on the markets lately," I said, swirling my wine. "I have been doing some small investments with the trust money." Ethan laughed, cutting into his ribeye. "That is great, babe," he said, not looking up. "Just do not lose the house." Okay. He did not ask what I was buying. He did not ask how much was in the account. He did not ask who was advising me. It was the ultimate insult. He assumed that whatever I was doing was trivial. He assumed that without his guidance, I was incapable of generating real wealth. His arrogance was my shield. He never looked because he could not conceive of a reality where I was his financial equal. 7 years passed. The world outside our mansion changed. The economy shifted. The Cole Heritage Group began to show cracks that only I saw because I was the only one actually reading their quarterly reports with a critical eye. They were heavy on commercial office space just as companies started downsizing. They were heavy on debt just as interest rates began to tick upward. But inside the Olivia Hart Trust, it was springtime. One Tuesday afternoon in October, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the country club. I had just finished a tennis lesson. My muscles itched pleasantly. I was wearing a white tennis skirt and a visor, the uniform of the idle rich. My phone buzzed. It was a secure notification from Marissa. Report updated. The text read. I opened the app. Face ID scanned my features. The screen is loaded. I stared at the number. Total net worth $8,342,000. I blinked. I read it again. 8 million. I looked out the window at the manicured golf course. I looked at the women walking toward the clubhouse, laughing, dependent on their husbands for every credit card swipe. For 7 years, I had felt like an imposter. I had felt like a guest in my own life, living on Ethan's charity, terrified of the day he might decide he was tired of me. But staring at that number, the fear evaporated. I was not a guest anymore. I was a bank. $8 million was not just money. It was freedom. It was leave whenever I want money. It was hire the best lawyers in the city money. It was burn it all down money. A realization washed over me, cold and clarifying. I did not need the Cole family. I did not need Ethan's approval. I did not need Robert's condescending protection. I had done what they said a broke girl could never do. I had beaten them at their own game, using the very rules they wrote to keep me down. I started the engine of my car. The vibration felt different today. It did not feel like I was driving Ethan's car. It felt like I was driving a tank. I drove home, the number glowing in my mind like a neon saying 8.3 million. And the best part was the market was just getting started, and the Cole Heritage Group was about to hit an iceberg when I walked into the house. Ethan was in the living room yelling at someone on the phone about a delayed construction permit. He looked stressed. His face was red. He looked up when I entered. Hey, he barked, covering the phone. We need to host the zoning commissioner for dinner next Thursday. Put it on the calendar. In the past, I would have scrambled. I would have felt the anxiety of pleasing him. Today, I just looked at him. I saw a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, barking orders at the ocean. Sure, Ethan, I said calmly. I will handle it. I walked past him up the stairs and into the shower. As the water hit my skin, I did not feel like the little house manager. I felt like a shark circling in deep water, waiting for the first drop of blood to hit the ocean. And I knew with the certainty of a mathematician that the blood was coming soon. The decline of the Cole Empire did not begin with a bang. It began with a stumble. Specifically, it began the morning Robert Cole collapsed in his rose garden, the victim of a mild stroke that left the left side of his face sagging and his iron grip on the company trembling. For 40 years, Robert had been the gravity that held the Cole Heritage Group together with him confined to a wheelchair and slurring his words. The vacuum of power was immediate and terrifying. Ethan was shoved into the captain's chair, a role he had coveted his entire life, but was woefully unprepared to handle. The timing could not have been worse. The commercial real estate market was entering a winter, unlike anything the industry had seen in decades. The remote work revolution had emptied the glass towers in downtown Chicago. Interest rates were climbing, turning the cheap debt that the Coles used like oxygen into a noose that tightened every month. I watched the panic set in from the periphery. I saw it in the way Ethan started drinking scotch at 4 in the afternoon. I saw it in the way he stopped sleeping, pacing the hallway of our mansion until dawn. Yet, to the outside world, nothing changed. We still threw lavish parties. Ethan bought a new Porsche to celebrate a deal that I suspected had not actually closed. They were playing a game of chicken with reality, convinced that if they just pretended hard enough, the market would bounce back before the banks called in the loans. One evening, I passed by Ethan's home office. The door was cracked open. I heard his voice, high-pitched and desperate. You cannot pull the line of credit now, Jim. Ethan was saying, we have a relationship. The vacancy rates are temporary. I just need 60 days. No, do not quote me. The covenants. There was silence. Then, the sound of a phone being slammed onto a desk. I pushed the door open. Ethan was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. Ethan, I said softly, He jumped, looking at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. How bad is it? I asked. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. It is fine. Live. Just standard banking nonsense. They get skittish when the Fed hikes rates. I walked into the room. I did not sit down. I stood across the desk from him, channeling the analyst I used to be. I saw the leverage report on the printer. Ethan, I said, the debt service coverage ratio is below 1.2. The banks have every right to call the loans. If you liquidate the residential portfolio now, you might be able to cover the short-term obligations. He stared at me. His face hardened. Excuse me, he said. You are overexposed in commercial office space. I continued, keeping my voice calm. I have been looking at the numbers. If you restructure the debt now, take a loss on the Michigan Avenue Tower, you can survive, but you have to stop spending. You have to stop pretending everything is fine. Ethan stood up. He walked around the desk and loomed over me. When did you become an expert on commercial real estate? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Because last time I checked, your biggest responsibility was choosing the centerpieces for the autumn gala. I am trying to help you, I said. I know how to read a balance sheet. Ethan, you play with stocks. Lev, he spat. You have a little trust fund where you buy utility shares and pretend you are a player. That is a hobby. This is a billion-dollar business. This is real life. Do not confuse your little game with what I do. I felt the slap of his words. He dismissed 7 years of my silent, successful management of millions of dollars as a little game. I walked out of the office. I told myself he was just stressed. I told myself he didn't mean it. But the cruelty was not just a byproduct of stress. It was a feature of his worldview. 2 weeks later at Sunday dinner, the personal attacks began. We were seated in the dining room of Robert's estate. Robert was at the head of the table eating soup with a shaking hand. Patrick Gallagher was there, of course, hovering like a vulture. The topic of conversation turned, as it always did, to legacy. We need to secure the future, Robert mumbled, wiping his mouth. The market is tough, but the name survives. The name always survives. He looked at me, then he looked at my stomach. It has been 7 years. Olivia, Robert said, we are still waiting for the next generation. The room went quiet. It was an open wound in our marriage. We had been trying for 3 years. Rounds of doctors, injections, disappointment. It was a source of private pain that I carried every day. Ethan took a sip of wine. He did not defend me. Dad is right, Ethan said, not looking at me. You know, Liv, maybe if you spent less time worrying about my company and more time focusing on your actual job, we would have an heir by now. My actual job. I felt the blood drain from my face. My job is to be a mother, I asked, my voice trembling slightly. That is all I am to you. A vessel. Ethan shrugged. It is the one thing we actually need you to do. I have an entire board of directors to give me business advice. I do not need it for my wife. I need a wife who manages the home and raises a family. If you are so stressed about the business, maybe that is why you cannot get pregnant. I stared at him. The cruelty was breathtaking. He was using our fertility struggles, a struggle that broke my heart every single month, as a weapon to silence me. He was reducing my entire existence to my biological function, dismissing my intellect as an obstacle to his lineage. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine in his face. I simply picked up my napkin, dabbed my lips, and placed it on the table. I will keep that in mind, I said quietly. The turning point came a week later. Patrick Gallagher requested a meeting. He said it was about estate simplification. Robert had obviously been looking at the books with the main company bleeding cash. They were looking for liquidity. They were looking for anything that was healthy enough to prop up the dying limbs of the empire. And they found Lakeside. They didn't know how much cash I had generated inside the trust, but they saw the valuation of the land. They saw that the junk company was suddenly the only asset in their portfolio that was appreciating. Patrick laid out the plan. They wanted to merge the Olivia Hart Trust into a new family dynasty trust. It is just for tax purposes, Patrick explained smoothly over the phone. We want to consolidate the assets under one umbrella. It simplifies the reporting for Ethan and Robert. I knew exactly what it was. It was a raid. If I moved my assets into the family trust, they would be commingled. They would become marital property. They would be used to collateralize the bad loans Ethan had taken out. I stalled. I told them I needed to read the documents. That led us to the Four Seasons. We drove there in silence. Ethan was agitated. Just signed the damn papers tonight. Live, he said as he steered the Porsche onto Michigan Avenue. Dad is anxious. He wants to know the family is united. I am just reading the fine print. Ethan, I said, there is no fine print. He snapped. It is family money. It all goes to the same place in the end. Stop acting like you have something to protect. Do I not? I asked. He laughed. You have what we gave you. Olivia, you have the shares Dad gave you. You have the allowance I give you. Do not pretend you are some independent entity. You are my wife. You exist under my umbrella. We arrived at the hotel. We walked into the private dining room. The air was cold. The crystals sparkled. Robert was already there. Patrick was there with his stack of papers. We sat down. The waiter poured the wine. I looked at the document Patrick placed in front of me. It was a deed of assignment, transferring all assets from the Olivia Hart Trust to the Cole Family Trust. If I signed this, my $8 million would disappear into the black hole of Ethan's debt. My freedom would vanish. I would be trapped, broke, and dependent on a man who despised me. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the paper. Is there a problem? Olivia, Patrick asked, his voice laced with irritation. I want to make sure this is the right move, I said. Patrick sighed. He looked at Robert, then back at me. He leaned forward, and that was when he delivered the line that sealed their fate. Prenups aren't for broke girls. Olivia, he said, smiling that oily, condescending smile. If you believe in this marriage, in this family, then this is just paper. Why hold on to it? Unless you think you are going to need every single penny for yourself. The table laughed. Ethan laughed. They looked at me and saw a broke girl clinging to a few scraps. They saw a woman who should be grateful for the crumbs from their table. I looked around the room. I saw their arrogance. I saw their desperation masked as superiority. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. Not a break, but a lock into place. I realized they did not deserve my help. They did not deserve my loyalty. I had offered them solutions, and they had spat in my face. I had offered them a partnership, and they had offered me a breeding role. I looked at the document. I realized that the only reason they were pressing me so hard was that they needed Lakeside. They needed the collateral. They were drowning, and I was the life raft they were trying to puncture. I picked up the pen. I looked at Ethan, who was wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. You are right, I thought. Prenups aren't for broke girls, and I am not broke. I did not sign the paper. At the last second, I lifted the pen from the page, leaving only a tiny, insignificant dot of ink on the signature line. I looked up at Patrick Gallagher, who was already reaching for the folder, his eyes bright with the anticipation of victory. Patrick, I said, my voice dripping with admiration, this drafting is incredibly complex. The way you have structured the interrust liabilities is fascinating. I simply cannot do it justice by skimming it over creme brulee. I closed the folder and pulled it toward my chest. I need 48 hours, I said, out of respect for your work. I want to read every word. I want to understand exactly how you are saving the family legacy. Patrick pined. His chest actually puffed out. He mistook my stalling for submission. He thought I was a diligent student trying to impress the teacher. Take the weekend. Olivia, he said, waving his hand magnanimously. It is dense reading. I am glad you appreciate the nuance. Ethan looked annoyed, but he was too relieved that I hadn't caused a scene to argue. He thought he had won. He thought the fish was in the boat, just flopping around a bit before the final clubbing. He did not know that the fish had just swam out of the net. The next morning, I was not reading Patrick's masterpiece in my sunroom. I was in a glass-walled conference room in the West Loop, sitting across from Marissa Hale and a woman named Narger Flores. Narger was a divorce attorney who was rumored to have a heart made of liquid nitrogen. She wore a suit that was sharper than Patrick's and cost twice as much. She did not smile when I shook her hand. She simply looked at the documents I had brought, her eyes scanning the pages like a laser reading a barcode. She read the prenup. She read the deed to the Olivia Hart Trust. She read the proposed family agreement that Patrick wanted me to sign. Then she laughed. It was a dry, terrifying sound. "Your father-in-law is a fool," Narder said, tossing the prenup onto the table. I blinked. Robert Cole is many things, but I have never heard him called a fool. He is arrogant, which is a specific kind of foolishness. Narder corrected. She tapped the trust document. He was so obsessed with keeping you away from Ethan's money that he built an impregnable fortress around you. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Listen to me, Olivia. In this state, inherited or gifted assets are separate property. Usually, the line gets blurry. People mix funds. They pay the mortgage with inheritance money. They buy a family car with a gift. Once you mix it, it becomes marital property. It becomes fair gain in a divorce." She pointed to Clause 143. But this clause explicitly forbids commingling. It mandates that your trust remains a silo by forcing you to keep everything separate to protect them. They have legally prevented themselves from ever touching a single cent of what you have grown. Marissa chimed in, pulling up a spreadsheet on the screen. "And because you reinvested every dividend directly within the trust, the growth is also separate. $8 million untouchable. Even if Ethan goes bankrupt, even if he sues you, it is ironclad. But if you sign this family agreement," Narja added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you blow up the fortress. You voluntarily mix your assets with theirs. And since they are drowning in debt, your $8 million will be sucked dry by their creditors before the ink is dry." I felt a cold chill slide down my spine. They were not just asking me to share. They were asking me to jump on a grenade to save a building that was already collapsing. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We go on the offensive," Narder said. "We do not just protect your money. We use it to dismantle them for the next 3 days." I became a spy in my own home. Ethan was so consumed by the crumbling business that he became careless. He left laptops open. He left files on the kitchen island. He took calls on speakerphone while I was arranging flowers in the next room. I learned the truth. It was worse than bad business. It was a fraud. I found emails between Ethan and the CFO discussing the employee pension fund. They had borrowed $3 million from the fund to cover operating expenses, marking it as a short-term loan that was already overdue. That was a federal crime. I found credit card statements for a shell company called AHC Consulting. Ethan was using company funds to pay for a luxury apartment in the Gold Coast and diamond jewelry for a woman named Jessica. He was looting the ship while the passengers were drowning. I took photos of everything. I downloaded the PDFs. I sent them to an encrypted server that Marissa had set up. Meanwhile, Marissa was digging into the finances of Cole Lakeside Holdings. The irony is almost poetic. Marissa told me over the phone the parent company, Cole Heritage Group, is a rotting carcass. It is weighed down by toxic commercial leases. But Lakeside, the unwanted stepchild, it is pristine, zero debt, high cash flow, and because you own 5% and the rest is held by the family. It is the only asset they have left that has any real liquidity. That was why they needed me to sign. They needed to pledge Lakeside as collateral for a new emergency loan. They needed my signature to mortgage the only good thing they owned. I sat at my desk and wrote a letter to Robert. It was not an emotional letter. It was a business proposal. I outlined the reality of the situation. I told him I knew about the pension fund. I told him I knew about the insolvency. I offered him a lifeline. I proposed that instead of merging my trust, we restructure Lakeside. I would use my capital to buy a controlling interest in Lakeside, injecting $12 million of liquidity into the family company in exchange. I wanted a seat on the board and the resignation of the current CFO. It was a fair deal. It would save them. I sent it via courier to his estate. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Patrick. "Olivia," Patrick said, his voice icy. "Robert received your note. He is very disappointed. He thinks you are confused. He thinks you are overstepping your bounds as a wife." There was a pause. He wanted me to remind you that he signed a prenup. Patrick continued, if you try to play hardball, you will leave this marriage with nothing. We will bury you in litigation until you are 45. Just sign the agreement. Olivia, stop playing games. He hung up. They ignored the offer. They ignored the warning. They threatened me with the very document that was actually my shield. I sat in my car in the driveway staring at the phone. They really do not see me, I thought. Even now, with a gun to their heads, they cannot imagine that I am the one holding the trigger. I called Marissa. Execute the buy orders, I said. Over the next week, while stalling Patrick with excuses about migraines and lawyer reviews, I went on a shopping spree. I did not buy shoes. I bought debt through the trust. Marissa and I quietly purchased distress bonds of 2 coal subsidiaries that were fundamentally sound but were being dragged down by the parent company's rating. We bought them for pennies on the dollar. We also bought stock in the vendors that supplied the coal hotels, companies that were desperate for cash because Ethan hadn't paid them in 6 months. My net worth, buoyed by the aggressive market moves and the deep discounts we were capturing, ticked upward. 9 million, 10 million, 12 million, $12 million. I looked at the number. It was not just a number anymore. It was a weapon. I met Narja at a coffee shop near the courthouse. She slid a document across the table. It is time, she said. I looked at the header. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Why now? I asked. Why not wait until the crash? Because you need to be off the ship before it hits the iceberg, Narja said. If you are still married when the creditors come for Ethan, they will try to freeze everything. They will drag you into depositions. They will try to pierce the corporate veil of your trust. She tapped the paper. But if you file now, you establish a date of separation. You trigger the prenup. You separate your assets legally and publicly. And because of the evidence you found, we have leverage. She pulled out a second document. It was a settlement offer. This is the offer we give Ethan. Narja said, it is simple. We honor the prenup. You keep your separate property, which is the trust. He keeps his separate property, which is the Detriton Company. You ask for 0 alimony. You walk away clean. And if he refuses, I asked. Narja smiled. Then we attach the exhibit regarding the pension fund embezzlement and the misappropriation of company assets for his mistress. We file it as part of the public divorce record. The SEC will be at his door by lunchtime. I looked at the papers. It was brutal. It was efficient. It was exactly what Robert Cole would have done if our positions were reversed. I thought about the night at the Four Seasons. I thought about the laughter. I thought about the broken girl comment. I thought about the 7 years of silence, of swallowing my pride, of being patted on the head like a golden retriever. I picked up the pen. This time there was no hesitation. This time I did not leave a dot. I signed my full name, Olivia Hart Cole. I handed the papers back to Narja. Violent. I said as I walked out of the coffee shop. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped my hair across my face. It was cold, but it felt clean. I checked my watch. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. Ethan was currently at a board meeting, trying to explain why they hadn't secured the loan yet. In an hour, a process server would walk into that meeting and hand him a manila envelope. He would open it. He would see my name. He would see the end of his marriage. But he would not realize, not yet, that he was also looking at the starting gun for the hostile takeover of his own life. I got into my car and drove toward the highway. I was not going home to make dinner. I was going to Lakeside. I wanted to see my property. The rain in Chicago does not wash things clean. It just makes the grime on the windows streak and blur, turning the city into a gray, indistinct smear. I was watching that gray smear from the window of a conference room in the Loop when my phone rang. It was Ethan. He had received the papers. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. Are you insane? Ethan screamed. There was no hello, no preamble, just the raw, high-pitched noise of a man who has lost control of his narrative. I held the phone away from my ear. In the background, I could hear the frantic energy of his office, phones ringing, people murmuring. He was doing this in public. Is this some kind of sick joke? Olivia, he shouted. I have a process server standing in my office. My secretary is crying. You filed for divorce. Now, when the banks are breathing down my neck, I spoke quietly. It is not a joke, Ethan. It is a legal filing. Read the petition. Read it. I am not reading this garbage. You are coming home right now and we are going to talk about this like adults. You are having a breakdown. That is what this is. The stress of the fertility treatments got to you. I will call Dr. Evans. He was still trying to diagnose me. He was still trying to frame my actions as hysteria rather than calculation. I am not coming home, I said. I am currently at the offices of Flores and Associates. Narger Flores represents me now. Patrick has already been notified. If you want to talk, you can come here. Bring Patrick and bring the prenup. I held up before he could respond. An hour later, they walked in. Patrick Gallagher looked like he had bitten into a lemon. His suit was impeccable, but his tie was slightly askew, a rare sign of haste. Ethan looked worse. His hair was wet from the rain, his face pale and drawn. He looked at me with a mixture of fury and confusion, as if he were trying to recognize the woman sitting across the table. I did not stand up. I sat next to Narger, my hands folded on the table. Patrick slammed his briefcase onto the mahogany surface. This is theatrical, Olivia, Patrick said, sitting down. Even for a divorce case, this is unnecessary drama. Ethan is willing to overlook this outburst. If you withdraw the petition today, we can discuss a postnuptial modification to get you a little more allowance. Narger smiled. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes. We are not withdrawing anything, Mr. Gallagher. Narger said, we are here to negotiate the settlement based on the existing prenuptial agreement. Patrick laughed. He actually laughed, shaking his head as he opened his briefcase and pulled out the document I knew by heart. The prenup, Patrick said, tapping the paper. The ironclad agreement that you signed, Olivia, the one that states quite clearly that you leave with what you came with, which, if my memory serves, was a student loan debt and a used Honda. He looked at me, his eyes hard. Ethan is prepared to be generous. We will offer a lump sum of $50,000 to help you get settled in an apartment, but that is it. If you press this, you walk away with zero. The law is on our side. Ethan leaned forward. Just stop this. Live, he said, his voice cracking. You are embarrassing yourself. You have no money. You have no job. Where are you going to go? Narger did not speak. She simply reached into her file and pulled out a thick stack of documents. She slid them across the table toward Patrick. I suggest you review the schedule of assets for the Olivia Hart Trust, Narger said. Patrick picked up the papers with a sneer. He adjusted his glasses. I know what is in the trust, he said dismissively. 5% of Lakeside. It is a worthless asset holding. His voice trailed off. I watched his eyes. They widened. They darted back and forth across the page. He flipped to the second page, then the third. His face went from flushed to a distinct shade of ash gray. This is impossible, Patrick whispered. What? Ethan asked, looking between us. What is it? Patrick looked up at me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrifying realization. $12 million, Patrick said. Ethan froze. What did you say? Ethan asked. She has $12 million in the trust, Patrick repeated, his voice hollow. Equities, bonds, real estate holdings. It is all here. Ethan snatched the papers from Patrick's hand. He stared at the numbers. Where did you get this? Ethan demanded, looking at me. Did you steal this? Did you take money from the house account? I leaned forward. I did not steal a penny. Ethan, I invested. I took the dividends from the gift your father gave me. I reinvested them. I leveraged them. I managed them. While you were busy running your empire into the ground, I was building my own. But this is marital property, Ethan shouted, slamming his hand on the table. We are married. Everything you made is half mine. Narger cut in, her voice sharp as a whip. Incorrect. Please refer to Article 4, Section 2, Clause 14.3 of the prenuptial agreement you drafted. Mr. Delbert. Patrick did not need to look. He knew the clause. Assets gifted to a separate trust and all income derived therein, provided they are not communal, remain separate property. Patrick recited from memory. Narger nodded. Exactly. Olivia never moved a cent into a joint account. She never paid a marital bill with this money. It is pure separate property under the laws of Illinois and the specific terms of your contract. Ethan has no claim to it. Not $1. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. The sound of the rain hitting the window seemed to amplify. Ethan slumped back in his chair. He looked at the papers in his hand, then at me. "You hid this from me," he whispered. "For years, you let me worry about money. You let me stress about the loans. And you were sitting on $12 million. I did not hide it," I said calmly. "You never asked. You never looked. You told me business was for the men. I just did what I was told. I stayed in my lane. You are a liar." Ethan spat. "You are a cold, calculating liar. You used me." I laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "I used you?" I asked. "You looked at me across a dinner table a week ago and told me my only value was breeding. You and your father built a legal cage to ensure I could never touch your money. You treated me like a broke girl who needed to be managed. I just proved you right. Ethan, prenups aren't for broke girls. And I am not broke." Patrick cleared his throat. He was trying to regain control, trying to find a foothold on a cliff face that was crumbling. "Olivia, listen," Patrick said, his tone shifting to a desperate sort of pleading. "Regardless of the legality, think about the optics. Think about the family. Robert is ill. The company is in a fragile state. If you walk away with this much capital and Ethan is left with the debts, it destroys the family honor." I looked at Patrick. "Otter?" I asked. I reached into my bag. I pulled out the second file, the one Marissa and I had compiled from the encrypted server. I placed it on the table. "If we are talking about honor, let us talk about AHC Consulting." Ethan went pale. "Let us talk about the $300,000 in company funds used to purchase a diamond bracelet for a woman named Jessica in the Gold Coast." I continued, "Let us talk about the $3 million borrowed from the employee pension fund to cover operating losses without board approval." Patrick froze. He looked at the folder, but he did not touch it. He knew what was inside. "That is federal fraud, Patrick," I said. "That is prison time." Narger leaned in. "Here is the situation. Gentlemen, we are filing for divorce. We are asserting that the Olivia Hart Trust is separate property. If you contest it, if you try to claim that money is marital, we will be forced to enter these financial documents into the public record during discovery." I watched Ethan. He was not angry anymore. He was terrified. He was looking at the end of his life. He looked at Patrick, waiting for his lawyer to save him, to pull a magic trick out of his briefcase. But Patrick was silent. He sat with his hands folded, staring at the polished wood of the table. He knew the checkmate when he saw it. "You cannot do this," Ethan whispered. "It will kill my father." "Your father created this," I said. "He wrote the rules. I just played the game." I stood up. My legs felt steady. My heart was beating slow and strong. "Here is the offer," Narger said, sliding a single sheet of paper forward. "We are generous, so we are keeping it simple. The prenup stands. Ethan keeps his assets and his debts. Olivia keeps her trust. No alimony, no spousal support. A clean break." Patrick looked at the paper. He picked up a pen. His hand was shaking slightly. "And the files?" Patrick asked, nodding at the evidence of fraud. "They stay sealed," I said, "as long as the trust remains unchallenged." Ethan looked at me. His eyes were wet. "I loved you, Liv," he said. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had met on a rooftop in New York, the man I thought was my partner. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was distant, like looking at an old photograph of a stranger. "You loved the version of me that you could control," I said. "You never knew me." Narger cleared her throat. "There is one more condition," Narger said. Patrick looked up. "What Olivia requires a specific clause in the settlement," Narger said. "A voting proxy." "What kind of proxy?" Patrick asked. "Suspicious." Narger smiled. "For the upcoming shareholder meeting of Cole Heritage Group," she said. "Olivia agrees to waive any claim to the marital shares of the parent company, provided that for this one meeting, she is granted the floor to speak as a representative of the minority interest holders of Lakeside." Patrick frowned. "Why? What do you want to say?" "I want to say goodbye," I said softly. Patrick looked at Ethan. Ethan was staring at the floor, defeated. "Fine," Patrick said. "Just sign the papers. Let us end this." Ethan signed. I signed. The sound of the pen on paper was the same as it had been 10 years ago, but this time it did not sound like a trap snapping shut. It sounded like a key turning in a lock. I walked out of the room into the hallway. The rain was still falling, but the gray smear of the city looked different now. It did not look depressing. It looked like a blank canvas. I checked my phone. Marissa had sent a text. "Is the proxy secured?" I typed back, "Yes." I walked toward the elevator. I had $12 million. I had my freedom. And in 48 hours, I had a shareholder meeting. Ethan thought I was walking away. He thought he had bought my silence with my own money. He was wrong. I was not done. The divorce was just the legal separation. The real reckoning was scheduled for Tuesday morning in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel. The Palmer House Hilton ballroom smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. It was a different venue from the private dining rooms of our past. Less intimate, more industrial, under the gilded ceiling and the heavy crystal chandeliers. 300 chairs were set up in rigid rows. They were filled with minor shareholders, employees whose pensions were currently in jeopardy, and local business reporters smelling blood in the water. I stood at the back of the room, concealed by a heavy velvet curtain near the service entrance. I watched the stage. Robert Cole sat in his wheelchair off to the side, a blanket over his knees despite the heat of the room. The stroke had left him diminished, his head lifting slightly to the left, but his eyes were still sharp, scanning the crowd for denters. Patrick Gallagher sat in the front row, his leg bouncing nervously. And there, standing behind the podium, was Ethan. He looked the part of the captain steering the ship through a storm. He wore a navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair swept back, but I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead under the stage lights. I could see the way his hands gripped the sides of the podium until his knuckles were white. "We are in the final stages of securing a comprehensive liquidity package," Ethan said into the microphone. His voice boomed through the speakers, confident and practiced. "This capital injection will allow Cole Heritage Group to weather the current market volatility and emerge stronger. We are leveraging our unencumbered assets to protect your investments." He was lying. The unencumbered assets he was referring to were the properties held by Cole Lakeside Holdings, the same properties that sat securely inside the Olivia Hart Trust. He was selling them a bridge he did not own. I looked at Narder Flores, who stood beside me. She checked her watch and nodded. "It is time," she whispered. Ethan continued. "We expect to close this financing by the end of the week. We just need a standard ratification from the shareholders today to proceed with the pledging of the Lakeside portfolio as collateral." Narder stepped out from behind the curtain. Her heels clicked sharply on the parquet floor, a rhythmic staccato that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman." Narder's voice rang out, clear and projecting without a microphone. Ethan froze. He squinted against the glare of the spotlight. The heads of 300 people turned in unison. "Who is that?" Robert barked from his wheelchair, his voice slurring slightly. "Security. I am legal counsel for the majority controlling interest of Cole Lakeside Holdings," Nardia announced, walking down the center aisle, "and I am here to inform the shareholders that the asset you are planning to pledge does not belong to Cole Heritage Group." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Ethan laughed nervously. "This is absurd," Ethan said into the mic. "Lakeside is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Cole family. Please remove this woman." Narder stopped in the center of the room. She turned and gestured to the back. I stepped out. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. I walked down the aisle, my head held high. I was not wearing the pastel dresses of a suburban housewife today. I was wearing a black suit, sharp and severe. I carried a laptop in one hand and a thick file in the other. "Olivier," Ethan whispered. His voice was amplified by the microphone, capturing his shock for everyone to hear. "What are you doing?" I walked up the stairs to the stage. I did not look at Ethan. I walked past him to the presentation laptop connected to the projector. I unplugged his slide deck and plugged in my own cable. The screen behind him flickered and changed. Gone was the slide showing an upward graph of projected earnings. In its place was a scanned legal document, the deed of the Olivia Hart Trust. "Good morning, everyone," I said, leaning into the podium microphone. Ethan stepped back as if physically pushed. "My name is Olivia Hart Cole. I am the sole beneficiary and trustee of the trust that holds the controlling 5% of Cole Lakeside Holdings." I clicked a button. Clause 14.3 appeared on the massive screen highlighted in yellow. "As you can see," I continued, my voice calm, "the assets within this trust are separate property. They cannot be pledged, mortgaged, or leveraged by Cole Heritage Group without my express written consent." I turned to look at Ethan, and "I do not consent." The room erupted. Reporters started shouting questions. Shareholders stood up demanding answers. Patrick Gallagher jumped out of his seat and ran toward the stage steps. "Stop this," Patrick shouted. "This is a private family matter. Cut the feed." I clicked the remote again. The screen changed. Now it showed an email thread. The subject line read, "Lakeside Collateral Strategy." The sender was Ethan Cole. The recipient was Patrick Gallagher. I read the email aloud, my voice cutting through the chaos. Ethan writes, "I know the trust language is tricky, but if we just pledge the assets as a block, the bank will not check the individual beneficiary details until after the loan funds. We can deal with Olivia later. She does not read the documents anyway." A collective gasp went through the room. I looked at the employees in the back rows. I saw their faces harden. They realized their CEO wasn't just incompetent. He was willing to commit bank fraud to save his own skin. "This is a fabrication," Ethan yelled, his face turning a deep, violent red. "She tampered with the emails." I clicked the remote again. "This is a report from an independent forensic accounting firm," I said. A new slide appeared. It showed a split-screen comparison on the left. The financial health of Cole Heritage Group, a sea of red ink, massive debt, and looming bankruptcy. On the right, Cole Lakeside Holdings green, profitable and solvent. The current management plan is to drag Lakeside down with the sinking ship. I explained to the shareholders they want to drain the equity from the one healthy company to pay off the interest on their bad bets. If they do this, both companies die. Your shares go to zero. The pension fund is wiped out. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. But there is another way. I looked at Robert. He was gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, his face pale. He knew what was coming. He knew I had the numbers. "I propose a separation. I announced I am willing to purchase the remaining family shares of Lakeside at fair market value. I will take Lakeside private, completely severing it from Cole Heritage Group. This injection of cash will allow the parent company to pay its immediate payroll obligations and restructure its debt without bankruptcy." I pointed to the screen where a list of numbers appeared. "This plan saves 300 jobs at Lakeside. It protects the pension fund. It gives the shareholders of Cole Heritage Group a fighting chance. The alternative is that the bank seizes everything by Monday morning." I looked at the crowd. Who wants to let Ethan drive the car off the cliff, and who wants to take the lifeboat for a second? No one moved. Then a man in the back, an old maintenance manager I recognized from the company picnics, stood up. "I vote for her plan," he shouted. "I second it," a woman yelled. Suddenly, the room was a roar of approval. They were chanting. They were demanding the board accept the deal. Ethan looked at the crowd, terrified. He looked at Robert. "Dad, do something." Ethan pleaded. "She is stealing the company." Robert Cole looked at me. He looked at the screen where his son's incriminating email was still glowing in high definition. He looked at the reporters frantically typing on their phones. He motioned for Patrick. Patrick ran up to the wheelchair. Robert whispered something in his ear. Patrick nodded, looking defeated. He walked up the stairs to the stage. He did not look at Ethan. He walked straight to me. "We need to talk," Patrick said quietly. "Off mic." I covered the microphone. "There is nothing to talk about. Patrick, you have the proposal. You sign over full control of Lakeside to my trust. I wire the funds for the buyout. We will announce it right now." "And the other matter?" Patrick asked, his eyes darting to the file in my hand. I lifted the file. This file contains the completed whistleblower reports for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service regarding the misuse of company funds for personal expenses and the pension fund irregularities. Patrick blanched. If Robert signs the separation agreement right now, I said, I will withhold the filing. I will let you handle the internal cleanup of the pension fund quietly, but if you hesitate, if you try to fight me, I walk out those doors and drop this in the mailbox. It was blackmail, or maybe it was justice. At that level of the game, there is no difference. Patrick went back to Robert. They spoke for less than 10 seconds. Robert closed his eyes and nodded once, a single sharp nod of surrender. Patrick returned to the podium. He took the microphone from Ethan's hand. Ethan looked like he had been slapped. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick said, his voice shaking, the board has decided to accept the proposal from Mrs. Hartcole. We believe this is in the best interest of the shareholders. The room erupted in cheers. Narder stepped forward with the documents. She placed them on the podium. Robert was wheeled up the ramp with a shaking hand. He signed the transfer of control. Then Ethan, looking like a ghost, was forced to sign as the CEO. I signed last. As I capped my pen, the flashbulbs of the cameras went off, blinding and relentless. I had done it. I had stripped the crown jewel from the empire right in front of the emperor's face. I packed up my laptop. I handed the file to Narder for safekeeping. I started to walk off the stage. Ethan grabbed my arm. His grip was weak, desperate. I stopped and looked at him. You just killed us, he hissed. His eyes were wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. You just killed the company my grandfather built. How could you do this? We are family. I pulled my arm away from his grasp. I smoothed the fabric of my jacket. I leaned in close so only he and the microphone could hear. No, Ethan, I said, I did not kill it. I just stopped letting you use it as a weapon against everyone else, including me. I turned and walked down the stairs. The crowd parted from me. I walked through the sea of strangers, past the reporters shouting my name, past the shareholders who were looking at me with awe. I walked out of the ballroom doors and into the lobby of the Palmer House. The air was cool and quiet. I took a deep breath. It was done. The heist was complete. But as I walked toward the exit, I knew the hardest part was not the taking. It was the leaving. And I still had one final piece of business to attend to before I could truly disappear. The final gavel stroke was not loud. It was a dull wooden thud that signaled the end of a decade. The divorce hearing took less than 20 minutes. There were no dramatic objections, no surprise witnesses, and no tears. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, simply reviewed the documents. The prenuptial agreement is valid, she stated, looking over the rim of her glasses at Ethan and Patrick. The court recognizes the distinct separation of assets as outlined in Article 4. Each party shall retain their separate property without claim from the other. I looked at Patrick 10 years ago. He had drafted those words to ensure I would walk away with nothing. Today, those same words ensured that I walked away with everything I had built. The irony was not lost on him. He refused to meet my eyes, shuffling his papers with a defeated energy. The judge signed the decree. It was over. I walked out of the courtroom and into the quiet, marble-lined hallway. The air felt cooler here, stripped of the suffocating heat of the courtroom. I was buttoning my coat when I heard footsteps behind me. Olivia, a voice called out. It was Ethan. He looked stripped down. The arrogance that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by a slumped posture and eyes that looked hollow. He did not look like the CEO of a real estate empire. He looked like a man who had woken up in a house that had been stripped to the studs. He stopped a few feet away from me. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then tried again. I just wanted to say, he started, his voice rasping. If I had known you had that kind of capital, I would not have pushed you away. We could have been partners. Real partners. He stopped. He seemed to hear the words as they hung in the air, realizing how grotesque they sounded. I looked at him. I felt a profound sense of pity. Even now, at the very end, he could not help himself. That is exactly the problem. Ethan, I said softly, you only respect value when you can see it on a balance sheet. You only treat people with dignity if you think they have leverage. I took a step closer. I hid the assets because I needed to know who you were when you thought I was nothing. I said, I wanted to see how you treated a broke girl, and you gave me your answer every single day for 10 years. Ethan looked down at his shoes. He had no defense. There was no defense. I looked at my left hand, the diamond ring, the one he had bought on credit, the one that had felt heavy for so long, sparkled under the H halogen lights. I slid it off. It passed over the knuckle easily. Underneath, the skin was pale, marked by a white indentation where the metal had pressed against my flesh for a decade. It looked raw, vulnerable, but it also looked free. I reached out and took his hand. I pressed the ring into his palm. It felt cold against his skin. Sell it, I said. You are going to need the cash for the lawyers. I turned to walk away, but a coughing sound stopped me. Robert Cole was waiting near the elevators, sitting in his wheelchair. His nurse stood a few feet back. He looked frail, his skin translucent like parchment paper, but his eyes were still sharp. He lifted a hand, beckoning me closer. I walked over to him for the first time. I did not feel intimidated. I did not feel the need to impress him. Olivia, he said. It was the first time in 10 years he had used my first name, not Mrs. Cole, not the girl, just Olivia. I looked at him. Robert, I said. He let out a breath that rattled in his chest. I thought I was building a wall to protect my son, he murmured, staring at the floor. I thought I was keeping the barbarians at the gate. I never imagined that by locking you out, I was actually locking the only competent person in the family in a room with a printing press. He looked up at me. A faint, crooked smile touched his lips. I created you, he said. I handed you the weapon and I dared you to use it. I suppose I cannot be angry that you actually pulled the trigger. It was a mercy kill. The company was dead anyway. I looked at the old man. I realized then that this was not a betrayal to him. It was a game. It had always been a game. And for the first time in his life, he had met a player who beat him. You can call it a betrayal if you want. Robert, I said, I call it correcting a systemic error. That prenup was a rope you used to tie my hands. I just turned it into a pair of scissors. He nodded slowly. He understood. We were not father-in-law and daughter-in-law anymore. We were two chess players staring at a board where the king had just been toppled. Goodbye, Robert, I said. I walked into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby as the doors closed, cutting off the sight of the two men who had tried to own me. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 25. That evening, I sat on the floor of a rented apartment in the Loop. It was not a mansion. The furniture was sparse and the view was of an alley. Not a lake, but it was mine. My name was on the lease. My money paid the rent. I spread the papers out on the hardwood floor, the deed to the trust, the stock certificates for the newly private Lakeside Holdings, the brokerage statements. I opened the calculator app on my phone. I tallied the final numbers. The buyout had cost me a significant chunk of liquidity, but the value of the assets I now controlled was substantial. $12,400,000. It was a number that was hard to wrap my mind around. Most of it was liquid now, tied up in the land and the buildings of Lakeside. But it was real. It was separate property. My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. It was a conference call from Marissa and Narger. I picked it up. Hey, boss, Marissa said, her voice cheerful. The wire transfer cleared. You officially own a resort company. How does it feel? It feels terrifying, I admitted, and wonderful. Good, Narger cut in. Because we have another proposal for you, I laughed. I am not sure I can handle another heist this week. Narger, this isn't a heist. Narger said, Marissa and I have been talking. The way you handled this, the way you used the legal structure that was meant to oppress you to actually liberate yourself, it is a blueprint. We want to start a fund, Marissa explained. A consultancy and legal fund for women who are about to sign prenups. Not to tell them not to sign, but to teach them how to read the fine print, to teach them how to build their own silos, to make sure that the next time a lawyer says prenups aren't for broke girls, the girl across the table knows exactly how to smile back. I looked at the papers on the floor. I thought about the millions of women who sign these documents out of love, blind to the fact that they are signing business contracts with people who view marriage as a merger. I said. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the city lights of Chicago. They were blinking in the twilight, a grid of endless possibilities. I was 36 years old. I was divorced. I was alone in a bare apartment. But for the first time in my life, I was not waiting for permission. I was not waiting for an allowance. I was not waiting for a man to tell me what I was worth. I was Olivia Hart, and I was just getting started. My laptop chimed from the coffee table. I walked over and opened it. My inbox was already flooded with messages. The story of the shareholder meeting had leaked to a few blogs. People were finding me. One email subject line caught my eye. It was from a sender I did not know. Subject: my fiancé's lawyer said prenups aren't for broke girls, too. I smiled. I sat down on the floor, pulled the laptop into my lap, and hit reply. I typed stranger. Let me tell you why that is the best news you could ever hear. I began to type. My story did not end with revenge against Ethan. That was just the prologue. The real story was about to begin, written one email at a time for every broken girl who was about to realize she was actually a bank. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Azad's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash the like button so more people can hear this story.